Hello, welcome to this very special interview because we have with us Mr. Yashwant Sinha, former finance minister, one of the senior most leaders of the BJP, just written a book on the future of the Indian economy, past reforms and challenges ahead, and perhaps it couldn't be better timed, sir, because we've just seen what is being described as one of the biggest tax reforms in the history of independent India. This, of course, GST itself is something that you also have been in many ways closely involved with. You've spoken about it, the concept of the mod VAT, the sen VAT and other things. So before we get into some of the other stuff that is there in the book, your take on this reform itself, do you feel it's one of the biggest reforms ever and overdue?
It's perhaps the biggest tax reform. But as you are aware, economy is more comprehensive than taxation. Taxation is one part of it. So while it is the biggest and most welcome tax reform of the indirect taxes of this country, central and state taxes, economic reforms is a bigger subject and encompasses a large number of areas. And there, as I have already said, I would rate the 1991 reforms as the biggest reform so far.
So that 1990-1991 reform period, which you were also involved with, I think you made the interim budget speech just before that main budget speech was made. You think that was the period that really was the biggest reform that we've seen?
Yeah, because apart from the reforms in the budget, which included taxation, which included budgetary reforms, which included other reforms, we also had the reform of the industrial policy. You know, we abolished the industrial policy which had been in existence in 1956, and that was a huge reform. There is no doubt about it.
Right.
And we have reaped the benefit of reforms during this period.
And however, as you mentioned in this book also, for some reason reform has never been as much, we've not been able to get as much of a political consensus around reform as we should have, as we might have, may have had major impacts on the Indian economy if we'd been able to get more of a consensus. I'm going to come to some of that in a minute, but seeing as GST is very much at the top of all of our mind, I want to get what your sense of it is, because I mean there are a lot of people who feel that yes, biggest tax reform, it's a great step, could have been better, there are still flaws in it, problems in it. How would you rate it?
No, I have already told you that I think that it is the biggest indirect tax reform of our country so far, and it relates to not only the Government of India taxes but also subsume the state taxes. So there is no doubt that it's a very big tax reform, and we have been working on it for the last 15-20 years. Now, having said that, I would say that it is the result of a compromise. There have been many interests, many participants in the process, and what has come out is a compromise. And a compromise is not always the best solution. And I am particularly saddened at the fact that it was after a great deal of effort that when I was finance minister and I introduced central VAT, I had ensured that something like 15 various slabs of taxes, central excise taxes, were collapsed into about 3. And there was a philosophy for it. What was the philosophy? The philosophy was that we should have a merit rate, a demerit rate, and a mean rate. And most of the products and commodities were in the mean rate. Now, under the GST...
So just to sort of explain that to our viewers, what you had tried to do, and that's in a sense been done away with to some extent in GST, you said, let's have most of the things as one central tax. You have a mean rate, I mean, then you have a demerit rate. So sin goods, cigarettes, liquor are taxed higher. And then there are good things, people that the poor are consuming, for example, which should be taxed lower, but have fewer rates. That's what was...
That was the philosophy which informed my decision.
So now we seem to have 6 rates, 7 rates if you start including cesses. This is something which you think should have been avoided?
Should have been completely avoided. Why did I work on 3 rates or evolve the 3 rates? Simply because there are 3 things. One is, if you have various rates, multiplicity of rates, then it introduces an element of discretion. On the day the GST was to be inaugurated, we had the GST Council reducing the rate on fertilizer
Right.
from 12% to 5%. Why did they decide to put it on 12% in the first
And that lobbying could continue. You'll have people saying, I shouldn't be
Yes.
18%, I should be 12%, I shouldn't
12%
be
will
28%,
say,
I should be
yeah.
18%.
So this
5% down
this
to
is what
0%.
I had experienced, that it led to lobbying, it led to discretion. Then you and I
remember
will
the
decide.
budgets when you used to present it, and before that in the late 90s, when every budget used to become a major event because every single commodity used to say, I am now being moved from this slab to that
Yeah.
slab, it's 12%,
Yeah.
not 18%. That drama has in a sense been done away with in budgets of
Yeah.
the recent past.
So
we're going back to that now.
we are
Although
going-
now it will be the GST Council that will decide.
that will
not the
make it
finance
even more
minister.
difficult. That, earlier it was the finance minister of the government of India in consultation with the prime minister who used to decide. Now he'll have to go back to the GST Council where all the states are represented through their finance ministers, and that will make it that much more difficult. Each state will look at its own gain and losses at every change in rate. So discretion is one, this lobbying is another, and the third is it will lead to litigation.
Yeah.
People will say, why am I in 5%, why not 3%?
I asked that question, I put that question to the Revenue Secretary, Mr. Adhia, and he says the fact that there's a specific HSN code now, which applies in every case, means that hopefully there shouldn't be too much. The lobbying will continue, but hopefully people will know which their product is and where it belongs.
No, but they will challenge the HSN.
They will challenge the HSN.
Yes.
I'm a branded textile, I'm a textile and I should be in this code and not in this code. That's what will happen, you're saying.
Yeah. I mean, between branded and non-branded, I went through this. So I like to tell you that suppose I run a Yashwant Sinha sweetmeat shop, mithai shop, and I have a dabba in which there is no name. If I give you a box of sweets in that dabba, then I will not be branded. It will not be a branded product. And if there is another dabba which says Yashwant Sinha sweets, and I give it to you in that dabba, then it will be branded. So does it make sense?
So that's a sort of a confusion
That is a kind of confusion.
Their argument is, and the government's view is that, look, we will try and collapse it going forward. Right now, we were trying to make sure that it is revenue neutral. We were trying to make sure it's not regressive. So avoiding you losing revenue and still making sure that the poor aren't hit is the reason we had to have so many rates.
No,
and it was a lack of consensus, which is why we had to keep some things out of GST completely.
They did not start from a clean slate.
Yeah.
There were rates from before, at least for central excise, for a state VAT. And this is what I am saying. To the best of my knowledge, when I was dealing with trying to evolve the state VAT, we were thinking of 4 rates at the most. So 6, 7 rates is something which I am unable to understand. And it was the duty of the finance minister of the government of India and the officials here to persuade the state finance ministers that we should settle for 3 rates, which makes sense.
At the end of the day, I guess part of the views that are being expressed is don't make the perfect. I've heard this phrase about 100 times in the last few days. Don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. We've got a consensus. We've got something. Let's launch it. We'll keep on fixing it. And yes, there will be short-term problems, implementation problems. And we are seeing some of that already, a certain amount of confusion, people not quite sure. We will fix that as we go along. Would you agree with that approach? And is that the same sort of approach you've taken in the past as finance minister?
I mean, considering that VP Singh introduced mod VAT in the 80s. I introduced central VAT 2000 or whenever, then the state VAT has come. Then we have been mulling over GST for the last 15 years or so. We have had enough time. It's not that the idea was mooted yesterday and we are implementing it today. We had all the time in the world, and we could have gone for a better GST. This is the point I am making. Okay. And somebody had to carry conviction.
Right. I just want to get your sense now, coming back to the theme of reform, and part of the thing that you mentioned in the book also is we've been unable to push reform over this entire period of time, and that's partly because you haven't had the political will. The governments have not been decisive enough. They haven't been able to push it through. Mr. Narasimha Rao, for example, often doesn't get the credit that he deserves for actually being decisive enough and able to take the risk. Maybe he was forced into it by the situation, but he forced through that reform. Why is it that we haven't been able to proceed in the period since then?
2, 3 reasons. One is that I mean, let's agree on what we understand by economic reforms. And I have recently said that the simple definition, to my mind, of economic reforms is anything which propels, fuels the engines of economic growth in the economy. Any measure is an economic reform. So, having defined it like this, I would say that most times these reforms are not directly connected to the people, masses of people. And the masses of people...
It's seen as being foreign investment, foreign portfolios.
Absolutely. Capital markets or whatever.
Foreign investors will like this.
Yes.
That's the sort of a thing.
That's the kind of thing.